In this video, we're going to be replacing the driver's side outer tie rod on this 2015 Hyundai Sonata. With the 21mm socket, we're going to go ahead and take our tire off. Behind our rotor, we have our outer tie rod end and our tie rod end here with a cotter pin at the top. It's a different type of cotter pin, so we're going to use a pick tool and a small pair of bent needle nose pliers. Our pick tool is going to pull out the back, and our pliers are going to pull the cotter pin straight out. And this is what it looks like. This is why you need to pull this side out. So now that we have our cotter pin removed here, we're going to use a 14mm socket. We're going to try and break this nut free. There is a chance that the center will spin. We're going to keep an eye. We're going to remember that our hole here for the cotter pin was in this direction. We're going to try and break this nut free and see if that spins. All right, so it looks pretty good. That hole for our cotter pin hasn't moved. We're going to continue, see how far we can get this. Looks pretty good. Usually if they've been in there a while, you'll have good luck with the center won't spin. If the center starts spinning, you're going to have to get on this with a 14mm wrench and socket on the top here to stop this from spinning. But in our case, we can just continue along with the 14. So now that you have your nut off, what you can do is hit the knuckle with a hammer to try and release your tie rod end straight out. Sometimes what I like to do, if you're replacing your outer tie rod end, is take that nut, flip it upside down, and just put it on one or two threads so it's as flush with the top as you can, and hit this straight down with the hammer. What that'll do is hit the nut in the top evenly, and you won't be mushrooming the top here, so you can still get on it if you need to reuse it for some reason. Ours came right out with a hammer, so now we can start to remove that. So on our lock nut here, we're going to put a 24mm wrench, and on our outer tie rod here, we are going to put a 22mm wrench and just start to loosen up our outer to the point where it'll come off by hand, because what we want to do is count the rotations of the outer tie rod until it's off. We're going to want to put it back on and spin it on to the same rotations in when we put it back in or replace it. So we're just going to get this loose enough to the point where we can do it by hand, but the entire time you want to be counting your rotations off. All right, so this outer tie rod definitely did not want to come off easy. So we're at 5, 6 turns. Just remember to count your turns on the way out. Okay, to remove our locking nut on our inner tie rod, we have a pair of locking pliers. We're going to rest them on the control arm, and a 24mm wrench. We're going to get on our locking nut. All right, so now that we know it's going to move, we're actually going to switch over to an impact. Okay, so we've swapped over to a 24mm on our impact. Back that nut off. And we did use a little bit of heat on that nut. If you need to, go ahead and do that. And because that nut is still super hot, I'm just going to use a pair of locking pliers to take it off. And we're going to put our lock nut or our jam nut in place, but we're going to send it pretty far back. So now we can take our outer tie rod end with the count we had when we spun off our old one. We can return our new tie rod end to that same amount of turns in. So to do that, we're just going to take our inner tie rod end and move it so that it's in a location that when we spin this, we're free of any obstructions. And we're going to count to that number of turns, full rotations in. You would do the same on yours, whatever your count was. All right, that's our count there. And what we're going to do is bring that lock nut in temporarily, loosely, up against our outer tie rod, just to hold that from moving around. Now, if you haven't moved your knuckle at all, you should be able to swing in your tie rod and locate the ball joint end into the knuckle. We did move ours, so we'll have to move our knuckle back in. But if your count is correct and you've centered this stud here, you should be able to get your tie rod end back into position without too much more hassle. Once you have your tie rod end in place, we can start to thread on our castle nut. So to tighten down your new ball joint end here, what you want to do is grab a 17mm wrench on your castle nut. And then in the center, it's going to be a 7mm. What that's going to do is hold the center stud from spinning all the way through while you tighten down your castle nut. Okay? In our case, this is brand new, and our castle nut is able to spin and tighten up without the center moving. So we're going to go right to the 17mm on a socket and tighten up that castle nut. So we're getting some resistance now. I'm going to keep an eye on where the hole is for your cotter pin. We're going to come back and we're going to torque that down. All right, so now we're going to torque our castle nut down to 30 foot-pounds while keeping an eye on that hole to make sure that it is lined up to get our cotter pin through. So there's 30 foot-pounds. You see we're almost lined up. So there is a slight variance in the torque specs from 25 foot-pounds to 32 foot-pounds, wherever you need to be to get that hole to line up. But you do not want to back your castle nut off to line up that hole. All right, so it looks lined up. So now what we'll do is we'll send that cotter pin through. So we're going to take one side of our cotter pin, and we're going to bend it back and around. We're going to do the same on the other side. And this cotter pin's actually fairly large, so we're just going to trim that down slightly. And that's it. Once you've gotten this far, your cotter pin's in, everything's aligned. We're going to tighten down our jam nut or our lock nut. That's going to be a 24mm. All right, now that you've got your lock nut tightened up, your cotter pin on, and your tie rod replaced, at this point, even though you got very close and it may have lined up perfectly, you have a new ball joint in that tie rod, new ends. You want to take your vehicle at this point to get a professional alignment. Make sure everything is in great working order. And now we can put our tire back on. Now that we're down on the ground, we're going to go ahead and torque our lug nuts to 75 foot-pounds. We're going to do that in a crisscross pattern.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.